This moment is not emotional, and it is not asking you to feel anything. It is precise. Precision does not announce itself with urgency or drama. It arrives quietly, already decided. If you are here now, it is not because something moved you emotionally, but because something aligned. There is a difference. Emotion pulls, alignment places, emotion fades, alignment holds. This moment did not appear because you were searching, scrolling, hoping, or asking. It appeared because the internal conditions required for recognition were met. Timing, like this, is exact. Not early, not late, not approximate, exact. Which is why it does not feel loud. Loud moments seek attention. Precise moments assume readiness. This is not a spark meant to excite you. It is a signal meant to register. That distinction matters. Many messages try to move people. This one does not. It waits for the right nervous system, the right level of awareness, the right internal stillness to arrive. And only then does it surface. This is how alignment works. It does not chase. It converges. This is not coincidence. Coincidence is pattern without meaning. Alignment is pattern with intention. You did not stumble into this. You were positioned into it. Long before your conscious mind recognized the path the conditions were being arranged. Small shifts, quiet withdrawals, a growing intolerance for noise, a subtle resistance to superficial explanations. These were not random changes in preference. They were preparations. The world often mislabels preparation as isolation, fatigue, confusion, or loss of interest. But preparation rarely feels like progress while it is happening. It feels like subtraction. Things fall away, distractions lose flavor. Conversations feel thinner. You begin to pause more often, not because you are uncertain, but because something in you is no longer rushed. That slowing is not apathy, it is calibration. And calibration always precedes reception. This message is not universal. It cannot be. Universality requires dilution. Precision requires selectivity. Not because some are better and others are worse, but because different phases require different inputs. You would not give advanced schematics to someone still learning how to hold the tools. Not as punishment, but as protection. In the same way, this message is not for the curious observer, the casual consumer, or the emotionally hungry. It is not here to inspire, uplift, or reassure. Those functions serve their purpose elsewhere. This is for the listener who has already been stripped of excess explanation. The one who no longer needs to be convinced that something deeper exists because their lived experience has already made that undeniable. Selectivity is not exclusion, it is specificity. This message assumes a certain level of internal honesty, endurance, and perceptual readiness. Without that, it would sound abstract, dramatic, or unnecessary. With it, it lands as recognition. That is how you know whether something is for you. Not by how it excites you, but by how little it needs to explain itself. Silence and pause are not empty spaces here. They are prerequisites. You cannot receive something precise while moving fast. Speed blurs detail. Noise drowns signal. Constant input creates false urgency, and false urgency makes discernment impossible. This is why the first instruction is not to act, react, or decide, but to pause. Pause is not inaction, it is orientation. It allows your internal systems to settle enough to register what is already present. Most people confuse silence with absence because they expect communication to be continuous and obvious. But the most consequential transmissions are often preceded by quiet. Not because nothing is happening, but because something complex is aligning. Think of how instruments are calibrated before measurement, how rooms are quieted before recording, how bodies instinctively still before sensing danger or truth. Silence is not the lack of signal. It is the removal of interference. If you are accustomed to constant stimulation, silence feels uncomfortable. If you are accustomed to depth, silence feels familiar. This message assumes you have learned, perhaps unwillingly, how to sit in quiet without immediately filling it. That capacity was not optional preparation. It was required. Without it, what follows would be misinterpreted as motivation, belief, or suggestion. That is not what this is. This is not here to encourage you to try harder. believe more, or think positively. Motivation relies on emotion to create movement. Revelation relies on clarity to create inevitability. Analysis does not push. It reveals structure. What you are about to engage with is not designed to make you feel powerful. It is designed to show you what has already been operating. There is no call to action here yet, because action without understanding creates noise. This is about seeing the pattern, the positioning, the sequence that led here. And yes, led. Past tense. You were prepared before you arrived. Preparation does not begin when you decide you are ready. It begins when life removes what you can no longer carry forward. Losses that made no sense at the time. Delays that felt disproportionate. Periods where effort did not equal outcome. These were not signs of failure. They were conditions being created. You were being slowed where others were sped up. You were being isolated where others were affirmed. You were being tested internally while external markers stayed quiet. That asymmetry is deliberate. It builds internal coherence without external dependency. By the time you arrive at a moment like this, you are no longer looking for permission or validation. You are looking for confirmation of something you already suspect, but have not fully articulated. That is the state this message requires. It does not introduce a new idea. It gives language to an existing awareness. That is why it does not rush. That is why it does not shout. It assumes you are capable of holding complexity without immediate resolution. It assumes you have already endured the discomfort of not knowing, of not being seen, of not being rewarded on schedule. Those experiences were not incidental. They trained your attention. They sharpened your perception. They taught you to notice patterns instead of chasing outcomes. So, before anything else unfolds, understand this clearly. Nothing here is trying to recruit you, convince you, or elevate you emotionally. This is not a turning point you need to manufacture. It is a checkpoint you have already reached. The only requirement now is honesty with yourself about that fact. If you are here, it is because the internal work necessary to receive this level of analysis has already been done. You did not miss anything. You are not late. You are not early. You are exactly on time. Silence is often misinterpreted because it feels the same on the surface as neglect, delay, or punishment, but those experiences come from entirely different intentions. Neglect is absence without awareness. Delay is postponement without preparation. Punishment is restriction meant to correct behavior. Silence in the context you are experiencing is none of those. Silence here is intentional containment. It is awareness withholding output, because output delivered too early would do damage instead of good. The human nervous system is trained to equate response with care, noise, with presence, movement, with progress. When none of those appear, the mind fills the gap with fear-based explanations. It assumes it has been forgotten, overlooked, or judged. But true silence does not come from disinterest. It comes from precision. When something carries weight, it is not dropped casually. When information has the power to destabilize identity, timing becomes more important than urgency. Silence, then, is not abandonment. It is supervision without interference. It is the kind of presence that watches closely without interrupting the process that must complete itself. Neglect would have let you deteriorate unnoticed. Delay would have kept you waiting without internal change. Punishment would have shrunk you through shame. What you experienced did the opposite. You were stretched, reinforced, and made more internally coherent. That alone disqualifies the idea that silence meant harm. Silence functioned as positioning. Positioning is rarely visible while it is happening because it works on internal orientation rather than external status. Think of how a structure must be set into place before it is loaded with weight. From the outside, nothing appears to be happening. From the inside, everything is being aligned, so it does not collapse under pressure later. Silence creates the conditions where maturation can occur without distortion. Maturation cannot happen while constant reassurance is provided, because reassurance interrupts self-regulation. If answers had arrived every time discomfort appeared, you would have learned dependency instead of discernment. If affirmation had come before clarity, you would have attached to identity before understanding its responsibility. Silence forces the system to stabilize itself. It removes external scaffolding so internal structure can form. This is not cruelty, it is engineering. Readiness is often misunderstood as desire. People assume that wanting something intensely qualifies them to receive it. Desire, however, says nothing about capacity. A container can want water, but if it is cracked, the water will destroy it. Capacity is the ability to hold without leaking, distorting, or collapsing. Readiness is not emotional hunger. It is structural integrity. You are not being evaluated on how badly you wanted answers, relief, or movement. You are being prepared to carry truth without using it to escape, perform, or inflate yourself. Capacity is built slowly, often invisibly, through pressure that does not break you, and silence that does not rescue you. Each unanswered question trained you to tolerate uncertainty without panic. Each delayed outcome trained you to decouple worth from timing. Each quiet season trained you to listen without demanding explanation. These were not arbitrary trials. They were measurements. Premature revelation would not have empowered you. It would have collapsed you. Not because you were weak, but because you were still forming. Information carries force. Identity-altering truth rearranges perception, relationships, priorities, and self-concept. Delivered before the nervous system can regulate around it. It creates fragmentation instead of clarity. You might have clung to it, defensively used it to bypass unresolved pain, or tried to perform it for validation. Any of those reactions would have distorted what was meant to stabilize you. Silence protected you from carrying meaning you would have had to defend instead of embody. It prevented you from building identity around language before experience had given that language depth. Many people collapse, not because they lack truth, but because they receive it before they have the internal weight to ground it. Waiting then was not denial. It was strengthening. Strengthening does not always look like forward motion. Often it looks like holding still under load. Muscles grow when resistance is sustained, not when weight is removed. Bones densify when stress is applied gradually, not when impact is avoided entirely. In the same way, your internal systems were being conditioned to withstand pressure without immediate relief. That conditioning is what allows stability later. If waiting had been denial, you would have stagnated. Instead, you changed. Your tolerance increased. Your reactions slowed. Your discernment sharpened. You became less reactive, less dependent on external confirmation, less eager to explain yourself. These are signs of strengthening, not rejection. Silence created space for self-trust to develop. It forced you to become your own witness instead of relying on constant feedback. It taught you how to stay present without immediate reward. That skill is rare, and it cannot be taught through explanation. It can only be learned through experience. This is why silence lasted as long as it did. Not because something was withheld arbitrarily, but because something was being built deliberately. When readiness is defined as capacity, not desire, the timeline makes sense. You were not waiting for permission. You were being reinforced. And now, the silence has served its function. Not by starving you, but by strengthening you enough to receive without collapsing. You are not being defined here by what you believe, what you claim, or what you say you stand for. Belief is easy to declare when circumstances cooperate. Survival is not. Survival leaves evidence in the nervous system, in the posture, in the way someone moves through the world after being stripped of illusion. This message is not for those who adopted an identity because it sounded meaningful or comforting. It is for those who remained standing when belief alone was no longer sufficient. When belief failed to explain what was happening. When belief did not soften the losses, prevent the betrayals, or shield you from the consequences of other people's choices. You are here, not because you held the correct ideas, but because you endured realities that would have dismantled someone who relied only on optimism. Survival is a different credential. It is quiet. It does not announce itself. It shows up in the fact that you are still functional despite having every reason not to be. Losses you did not anticipate rewrote your internal landscape. People you trusted withdrew, turned, or disappeared without explanation. Structures you assumed were stable collapsed when you leaned on them. These were not symbolic experiences. They were concrete. Relationships ended not with closure, but with confusion. Opportunities vanished after effort had already been invested. Support failed to materialize at the moment it was most needed. And still, you adapted. Not gracefully, not heroically, but practically. You learned how to keep moving without clarity, how to breathe while carrying unanswered questions, how to continue functioning when the story you told yourself no longer worked. These are unseen battles because they do not register externally as dramatic victories. No one applauds restraint. No one celebrates quiet endurance. No one documents the nights where you decided not to quit, not to retaliate, not to numb yourself, not to disappear. Those decisions leave no visible markers, but they accumulate internally. They change how a person processes pressure. They create depth without spectacle. You were tested without being informed. You were under examination. That is the most accurate kind of test. When someone knows they are being evaluated, behavior shifts. Performance replaces authenticity. But when pressure arrives without warning, what emerges is unfiltered. How you responded when no one was watching, when no reward was promised, when no explanation was offered, that is what was noted. You were measured by consistency under ambiguity, by restraint under provocation, by persistence without reassurance. These are not tests designed to be passed consciously. They are diagnostic environments. You did not know you were passing them because there was no feedback loop, no confirmation, no immediate outcome. And yet, each time you chose to stay engaged with life instead of withdrawing completely, something was recorded. Each time you adjusted instead of collapsing, something was reinforced. This is why your legitimacy does not come from purity. Purity implies untouched, untested, unchallenged. You are not that. You are marked by contact. You have been affected, altered, complicated. Your clarity was earned through friction, not preservation. Legitimacy here comes from persistence. Persistence does not require certainty. It requires continuity. It is the decision to continue participating even when the narrative breaks down. Optimism relies on expectation. Endurance does not. Optimism assumes things will improve. Endurance functions even when improvement is not guaranteed. There were periods where you did not expect resolution. You did not believe everything would work out. You simply chose not to stop. That distinction matters. Many people confuse hope with strength. Hope is helpful, but it is not structural. When hope collapses, so do those who rely exclusively on it. Endurance operates beneath hope. It is mechanical, grounded, sometimes joyless. It says, regardless of outcome, I will remain present. That posture is rare. It is also unmistakable. You were not protected from damage. You were shaped by it. You were not spared confusion. You learned how to function within it. You were not kept clean from contradiction. You learned how to hold opposing truths without needing to resolve them immediately. That is not purity. That is capacity. And capacity is what qualifies you here. Many people believe intensely and yet fragment under sustained pressure. Others believe inconsistently and still endure. This message is not interested in the former. It is calibrated for the latter, for those whose belief was stripped down to something quieter and more durable. For those who stopped announcing what they believed because belief had become private, functional, and tested. Persistence is unglamorous. It does not trend. It does not announce itself. But it is reliable. It produces people who can carry weight without needing to be seen carrying it. People who do not need constant affirmation to remain aligned. People who have already survived the disappointment of unmet expectations and did not allow that disappointment to calcify into bitterness. That alone sets you apart. Not morally, structurally. You are not here because you remained pure. You are here because you remained. When leaving would have been understandable. When disengaging would have been reasonable. When numbing would have been easier. You stayed present. That presence under pressure is the defining feature. It is what makes you readable at this stage. It is what allows this message to land as recognition rather than fantasy. You do not need to be told you are chosen in order to feel special. That language would have meant nothing to you in the middle of what you endured. What you needed then was stability, not symbolism. And you built it slowly, imperfectly, often, without support. That is why this message addresses you as someone who has already proven something without knowing it was being proven. Survival shaped you more accurately than belief ever could. Joseph is not introduced here as inspiration or moral encouragement, but as a structural precedent, a case study in how capacity is engineered through contradiction rather than comfort. His story is often flattened into a narrative about patience and eventual reward, but that interpretation misses the mechanism entirely. Joseph's life demonstrates a pattern in which early revelation is not permission to act, but exposure to pressure, where the distance between vision and fulfillment is not wasted time, but necessary reconfiguration. The dreams arrived when his internal structure could not yet support them. That was not a mistake. The dreams were not given to activate his future, but to destabilize his present. They revealed something true without giving him the tools to manage its consequences. As a result, contradiction entered immediately. The dreams elevated him internally while his external position collapsed. Favor at home turned into rejection. Visibility turned into vulnerability. Certainty about destiny collided with complete loss of control over circumstance. This contradiction was not incidental. It was the training environment. Character was not built by affirmation, but by sustained exposure to opposing forces that could not be reconciled quickly. Joseph was told something true about his future while being placed in conditions that made that truth unusable. That gap forced development. If activation had followed revelation immediately, his identity would have fused with entitlement. Instead, the delay separated calling from ego. The dreams created internal orientation. The years that followed dismantled any attempt to perform that orientation prematurely. Activation arrives late because activation requires a nervous system capable of holding authority without needing validation. Joseph did not become capable of stewardship because he believed in his dreams. He became capable because belief alone failed to protect him, failed to explain his suffering, and failed to deliver him from consequences. Each contradiction refined him. Being sold by his brothers did not simply wound him emotionally. It removed inherited status. It forced him to operate without legacy, without protection, without narrative advantage. Serving in Potiphar's house trained competence under authority without recognition. False accusation dismantled any illusion that integrity guarantees safety. Prison stripped away even the illusion of progress. These were not random setbacks. Each environment removed a different dependency. Each phase isolated a different weakness. By the time Joseph interpreted dreams in prison, he no longer needed his own dream to validate him. That is the shift. Transformation is not delay, it is requirement. Activation without transformation would have amplified instability. Dreams arrive early because they orient direction, not readiness. They tell you where you are going, not who you must become to arrive there without imploding. The pain that follows is not punitive, it is preparatory. Pain exposes reactions. It reveals where identity is still attached to outcome, where worth is still dependent on acknowledgement, where power would be misused to resolve old wounds rather than steward responsibility. Joseph's pain forced him to metabolize disappointment without becoming cynical. It trained him to operate effectively in systems that were unjust without internalizing injustice as identity. This is why his eventual elevation did not produce retaliation. By the time power was accessible, vengeance no longer felt necessary. Pain had already processed the offense. That is preparation. The delay was not about waiting for the right moment externally. It was about building internal architecture capable of sustaining the weight of fulfillment. If the dream had activated early, Joseph would have ruled from injury. Instead, contradiction refined him into someone who could recognize his brothers without needing to destroy them, someone who could hold authority without rewriting history to flatter himself. The pain was not the price of the dream. It was the mechanism that made the dream safe to fulfill. Early dreams expose trajectory. Late activation confirms capacity. Everything in between is not absence but construction. Joseph's life shows that contradiction is not a sign of error, but evidence of intentional design. When vision and reality clash repeatedly, it is not because the vision was false, but because the vessel was incomplete. Pain applied pressure until the vessel could hold what was promised without cracking. That is not delay. That is engineering. Emotional volatility is often misread as regression or instability, but in transitional phases, it is more accurately understood as recalibration. When an internal system is being adjusted to operate at a different level of coherence, fluctuation is not a failure signal, but a tuning process. Just as instruments shift in tension before settling into resonance, the emotional body responds when old regulatory patterns are no longer sufficient. What feels like being more sensitive, more reactive, or less predictable is frequently the nervous system abandoning outdated thresholds. You are not becoming unstable. You are becoming reconfigured. The volatility arises because previous emotional defaults no longer resolve incoming information efficiently. Old coping mechanisms lose their effectiveness before no new ones are fully integrated, creating a temporary gap where sensation intensifies. This is not disorder. It is transition. Physical and mental shifts often accompany this recalibration because the body and mind are not separate systems, but mirrored processors of change. Fatigue, altered sleep patterns, appetite fluctuations, pressure in the chest, sudden clarity followed by fog, heightened perception followed by withdrawal. These are not random symptoms. They are transitional effects that appear when internal prioritization is being rewritten. Energy that was once allocated to maintenance of an old identity is redirected toward restructuring. The body experiences this as demand. The mind experiences it as interruption. Together they signal that a background process is running. Many mistake these sensations for stress, but stress implies resistance to demand, whereas restructuring implies adaptation to a new load. Stress depletes. Restructuring reallocates. The difference is subtle but critical. In stress, systems break down because capacity is exceeded without support. In restructuring, systems temporarily destabilize because capacity is being expanded. The sensation can feel similar, but the trajectory is different. Withdrawal during this phase is often misinterpreted as avoidance depression or disengagement, when in reality it is frequently the rejection of an old frequency. As internal coherence increases, environments, conversations, and behaviors that once felt neutral begin to feel abrasive or draining. This is not superiority or judgment. It is resonance mismatch. The system naturally pulls away from inputs that interfere with integration. Silence becomes necessary, not because there is nothing to say, but because speech would anchor you to patterns you are no longer organized around. Solitude becomes functional, not emotional. It allows signals to settle without interference. Withdrawal is not always about fear or fatigue. Sometimes it is about preserving signal integrity while recalibration completes. Separating stress from restructuring requires attention to directionality. Stress narrows perception and reduces adaptability. Restructuring temporarily disrupts comfort, but ultimately increases clarity and capacity. After stress, you feel diminished. After restructuring, even if tired, you feel more aligned, more precise, more internally ordered. The discomfort serves a purpose. It reveals which internal codes are obsolete. Emotional spikes often occur when an old interpretation is automatically applied to a situation that now requires a different response. The spike is feedback. It highlights where recoding is needed. Internal recoding is the process by which unconscious assumptions, reflexive meanings, and inherited narratives are rewritten at a foundational level. This does not happen through conscious affirmation alone. It happens through repeated exposure to experiences that contradict existing code until the system updates to maintain coherence. During recoding, reactions may feel disproportionate because the system is testing new parameters. You may notice delayed responses where you once reacted instantly, or sudden clarity where confusion used to live. These are signs of new pathways forming. Mental shifts, such as questioning long-held beliefs, losing interest in previously motivating goals, or feeling detached from identities that once felt central, are not signs of emptiness. They are indicators that internal references are being reassigned. The mind is no longer organizing around the same incentives. This can feel disorienting because meaning structures are in flux. Emotional volatility surfaces because meaning is the stabilizer of emotion. When meaning is under reconstruction, emotion fluctuates. The key distinction is that this volatility is directional. It trends toward coherence, not chaos. Each wave clears residue. Each contraction refines boundary. Over time, responses become cleaner, less entangled, more proportionate. That is recalibration completing its cycle. Internal recoding also affects perception of time urgency and attachment. You may feel less compelled to explain yourself, less anxious about outcomes, more selective about engagement. This is not detachment from life, but reorientation toward accuracy. The system is learning to conserve energy by refusing misalignment. What once required effort becomes automatic. What once felt necessary becomes optional. Emotional volatility is the byproduct of this shift, not the destination. It marks the crossing point between operating systems. The body and mind signal during this phase because they are updating protocols for safety, relevance, and authority. When recalibration finishes, stability returns. But it is a different stability than before. It is not built on suppression or endurance, but on alignment. Understanding this reframes the entire experience. You are not unraveling. You are being tuned. The noise is temporary. The signal is strengthening. What you are experiencing unfolds in layers, not symptoms. And understanding those layers prevents you from mislabeling transformation as malfunction. The first layer is energetic retuning, and the sudden intolerance for misalignment. This is where most confusion begins, because nothing dramatic has happened externally. Yet, internally, your system refuses what it once tolerated. Conversations feel abrasive. Environments feel noisy. Obligations feel heavier than their actual weight. This is not impatience or arrogance. It is retuning. When an internal frequency shifts, anything calibrated to an older setting produces friction. Previously, your energy adapted outward to maintain harmony. Now, harmony requires accuracy, not accommodation. The nervous system, the emotional body, and perception itself begin rejecting distortion. This is why misalignment feels physically uncomfortable rather than merely annoying. You are no longer buffering incoherence. You are filtering it out. Energetic retuning is not gentle. It strips tolerance first, then restores discernment. Many mistake this phase for becoming difficult or less compassionate, but the opposite is true. Compassion that requires self-distortion is not compassion. It is self-erasure. Retuning ends that contract. Your system recalibrates to hold coherence rather than consensus. This creates an intolerance for roles, relationships, and rhythms that rely on you being smaller, quieter, or less precise. The body participates fully. Fatigue increases because energy is being redirected inward. Emotions spike because old regulators no longer dampen signal. Silence becomes necessary because speech locks frequency, and your frequency is still shifting. This layer feels like rejection of the world, but it is actually rejection of distortion. The second layer follows naturally dissolution of fear-based soul agreements. These are not mystical contracts, but deeply ingrained survival patterns formed when fear once served as protection. Agreements like, I must be understood to be safe. I must be useful to belong. I must endure to deserve. I must soften truth to avoid loss. These agreements operated quietly, often invisibly, shaping decisions, tolerances, and self-concept. During retuning, these agreements surface because they no longer function at the new frequency. What once kept you safe now constricts you. Fear-based agreements dissolve not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The system outgrows them. This dissolution can feel like grief guilt or disorientation, because identity was partially built around these contracts. When they dissolve, the scaffolding disappears before the new structure is visible. This is where many panic. They feel unanchored, unsure who they are without the familiar fears that once organized their behavior. But this is necessary. You cannot graduate while carrying survival strategies meant for a previous environment. Dissolution precedes form. In metamorphosis, the caterpillar does not immediately become a butterfly. It enters a stage of dissolution where the old form breaks down into imaginal cells. From the outside, it looks like collapse. Internally, it is precise reorganization. Fear-based agreements dissolve in the same way. They do not politely exit. They disintegrate. You may notice sudden refusal to over-explain, inability to perform emotional labor, loss of patience for manipulation, or discomfort with dynamics that rely on your guilt. This is not coldness. It is contract termination. The fear that once negotiated your presence no longer has authority. With its dissolution comes a void. That void is not emptiness. It is unclaimed space. The third layer is operational reassignment and graduation. This is where the disorientation gains meaning, though rarely immediately. Graduation does not feel like celebration at first. It feels like being released from an old post without clear instructions for the new one. You are no longer required where you once were, but you are not yet deployed where you are going. This interim is critical. It prevents you from recreating old structures with new language. Operational reassignment happens only after fear-based agreements dissolve, because otherwise new authority would be exercised through old insecurity. Graduation requires neutrality. It requires the ability to stand without proving, fixing, or performing. This is why stillness increases. Activity would pull you back into familiar roles. Silence protects the reassignment process. During this phase, attention shifts from external validation to internal alignment. You may feel less ambitious in conventional terms, yet more exacting internally. You may lose interest in recognition, while gaining clarity about responsibility. Authority begins to reorganize inside you, not as dominance, but as position. Position is quiet. It does not announce itself. It stabilizes. Metamorphosis. Imagery matters here because it normalizes what logic resists. In true transformation, there is a stage where the old form no longer exists and the new form is not yet operational. This is not failure. It is design. Disorientation is necessary because orientation to the old map would sabotage emergence of the new one. If the caterpillar retained its identity mid-dissolution, it would interfere with reformation. Likewise, your sense of self becomes fluid so it can be accurately reconstituted. Confusion does not mean you are lost. It means the compass is recalibrating. Many try to resolve this phase prematurely by forcing clarity, seeking labels, or returning to familiar structures. This delays integration. The system knows when to settle. Until then, ambiguity is protective. It prevents premature attachment. Normalizing disorientation is essential because resistance amplifies suffering. When you understand that dissolution precedes form, you stop trying to stabilize what is meant to be fluid. You allow the process to complete. Energetic retuning sharpens discernment. Dissolution of fear-based agreements clears distortion. Operational reassignment installs new capacity. These layers are sequential but overlapping. You may revisit aspects of each as integration deepens. What remains consistent is directionality. You are not unraveling, you are reorganizing. The discomfort is not punishment, it is precision. When the new form stabilizes, it will feel simpler, not grander. Lighter, not louder. You will recognize it not by excitement, but by ease. The world will not suddenly change, but your relationship to it will. Misalignment will no longer tempt you. Fear will no longer negotiate for you, and your position will no longer require explanation. Repeating numbers and symbolic interruptions rarely announce themselves with drama, because what is being communicated does not require spectacle to be authoritative. Patterns do not shout, they repeat. When numbers begin appearing with unnatural consistency on clocks, receipts, license plates, timestamps, it is tempting to reduce them to coincidence or superstition. But coincidence dissolves when repetition carries timing, relevance, and internal response. The key is not the number itself, but the interruption it creates. Your attention is briefly pulled out of momentum. A pause occurs. That pause is the message. It signals that awareness is being tuned to notice pattern rather than noise. These interruptions are not commands or predictions. They are markers, like quiet taps on the shoulder, reminding you that something beneath the surface is active. Symbolic interruptions work the same way. Songs playing at exact moments, overheard phrases that mirror private thoughts. Books opening to relevant passages. Unexpected delays that redirect outcomes. None of these are grand miracles. They are whispers inserted into ordinary flow. Their power comes from precision, not force. Sudden memories often follow, not nostalgia, but specific recollections, resurfacing without invitation. Conversations, long forgotten, decisions made under pressure, moments of restraint or refusal that seemed insignificant at the time. These memories are not random. They are being recontextualized. The mind retrieves them because the present moment now has the capacity to integrate their meaning. What once could not be understood emotionally or cognitively is brought back when the internal environment is stable enough to process it. This resurfacing can feel disorienting because it collapses time, past and present touch. You realize patterns have been running longer than you knew. Alongside memories, people resurface. Names appear in your thoughts. Messages arrive from those you have not spoken to in years. Encounters happen without planning. This is not fate pulling strings for reunion. It is alignment revealing unresolved threads. Some reappear to close loops, some to test boundaries, some simply to be seen clearly one last time from a new vantage point. Their return does not always mean reconnection. Often it means completion. Dreams intensify during this phase, but they resist clarity. You wake with emotional residue rather than narrative recall. Images dissolve, but the feeling remains. These are not dreams meant to be decoded literally. They are integration processes. The subconscious communicates through atmosphere, not language. It rehearses scenarios, releases stored emotion, and tests new responses. The lack of full recall is intentional. Conscious analysis would interfere. What matters is not what you saw, but how you feel upon waking steady, unsettled, resolved alert. That feeling informs waking behavior, subtly adjusting posture, tone, and choice without explanation. Heightened sensitivity to noise and distraction emerges as the system prioritizes signal integrity. Loud environments feel invasive. Multitasking becomes draining. Small interruptions provoke disproportionate irritation. This is not fragility. It is refinement. As internal processes become more coherent, tolerance for interference decreases. The nervous system no longer numbs itself to maintain performance. It protects clarity instead. Silence becomes restorative rather than empty. Stillness becomes necessary rather than optional. You begin to notice how much of the world operates through constant stimulation to avoid presence. Your sensitivity is not a weakness. It is an indicator that perception is no longer dulled. This is why whispers matter more than spectacle. Spectacle overwhelms and demands reaction. Whispers invite attention and choice. They respect readiness. True recalibration does not require signs in the sky or dramatic revelations. It works through subtle repetition, gentle interruption, and quiet insistence. The system is being trained to listen without force, to recognize without panic, to respond without performance. The quieter the signal, the more it requires internal stillness to detect. This is deliberate. If transformation depended on spectacle, it would favor the reactive, not the receptive. Whispers select for those who can pause. Repeating numbers train pattern recognition. Memories reframe identity. Resurfacing people test integration. Dreams recalibrate emotion. Sensitivity protects coherence. None of these demand belief. They function regardless of interpretation. You do not need to label them as spiritual to be affected by them. They operate at the level of attention and regulation. Over time, you may notice reduced urgency to explain experiences to others. Not because they are secret, but because explanation feels unnecessary. The process is internal, and external validation would distort it. You learn to trust the accumulation of subtle cues rather than waiting for dramatic confirmation. This shifts authority inward. You stop scanning for permission. You start noticing alignment. The world does not become quieter. You become more selective about what you amplify. Whispers become sufficient because you no longer require force to pay attention. That is the point. Resistance does not appear because something is wrong with the path. It appears because an identity that once kept you alive can feel its expiration approaching. What panics is not your intuition, not your awareness, not your future self, but an outdated structure that recognizes it is losing authority. Identities are not abstract concepts. They are operating systems built from repetition, fear adaptation, and reinforcement. When an identity has organized your decisions for years, even decades, its dissolution feels like threat, not relief. Resistance is that system's last attempt to preserve relevance. It does not argue logically. It escalates emotionally. It produces urgency, doubt, nostalgia, and self-questioning all at once. This is why resistance often feels irrational and sudden. It is not evaluating truth. It is defending territory. The moment growth becomes irreversible, the expired identity loses leverage. Panic follows. Doubt often arrives at the same time, but doubt here is misunderstood. This doubt is not disbelief in what you are becoming. It is a survival reflex, trained under earlier conditions. Survival-based doubt evolved to keep you from moving faster than your environment could tolerate. It asked questions like, is this safe? Will this cost me belonging? What happens if this fails? These questions once protected you. They slowed you down when risk meant real harm. But when capacity expands and context changes, the same reflex misfires. It interprets expansion as danger because it has not updated its parameters. The doubt feels personal, but it is procedural. It is the nervous system checking an outdated rulebook. This is why the doubt does not come with evidence. It does not argue against facts. It simply creates discomfort. Understanding this reframes the experience completely. You are not unsure because the path is unclear. You are uncomfortable because an old survival mechanism is still firing in a situation where it no longer applies. That mechanism cannot imagine a version of you that does not require its protection. It assumes its relevance is permanent. When it senses it is no longer needed, it interprets that as extinction. Panic follows extinction cues. Recent choices often trigger this shift, though they may seem small on the surface. A boundary you held without over-explaining. A truth you did not soften. A pattern you refused to repeat. A moment where you chose alignment over approval. These choices are not dramatic, but they are irreversible because they change internal reference points. Once you know you can survive without betraying yourself, you cannot unknow it. Once you experience self-respect without collapse, you cannot return to self-abandonment as default. The identity that relied on compromise loses its leverage. That is the point of no return. Growth over comfort is the decisive factor. Comfort maintains identity. Growth transforms it. The moment growth becomes the priority, comfort stops being the organizing principle. This does not mean life becomes harder. It means decisions become clearer. You stop negotiating with fear. You stop asking whether something will keep you safe and start asking whether it is true. That shift is subtle but absolute. It is not about bravery. It is about coherence. Once coherence becomes non-negotiable, regression is no longer possible, because regression would require conscious self-violation. You may revisit familiar feelings, environments, or people, but you will not re-enter the same internal position. The old identity depended on unconscious participation. Awareness disrupts that permanently. You cannot go back to not seeing what you see. You cannot return to believing what no longer aligns. Resistance intensifies precisely because the system recognizes this finality. It throws everything it has at you. Doubt framed as realism. Fear framed as caution. Nostalgia framed as wisdom. But none of it fits the present moment. That mismatch is the signal. When resistance feels loud but unconvincing, when doubt feels present but hollow, when fear surfaces without authority, you are witnessing an identity losing jurisdiction. This is not a crisis. It is a handover. The new orientation does not announce itself loudly. It stabilizes quietly. You notice it in your inability to pretend, your reduced tolerance for misalignment, your unwillingness to argue yourself out of clarity. You may grieve what is ending, but you do not wish to return to it. That is how you know regression is no longer possible. The bridge has burned, not because you destroyed it, but because you crossed it fully. What remains ahead is not comfort in the old sense. It is congruence. And once congruence becomes the baseline, even discomfort serves purpose rather than fear. Reassignment in the spiritual realm does not arrive with ceremony or announcement, because true authority is rarely introduced theatrically. It is recognized by function, not title. Reassignment occurs when an internal capacity has outgrown the environment it was trained in, and the previous role can no longer apply meaningful pressure. This is not promotion in a human sense. It is redeployment. The conditions around you change because the conditions within you have already changed. What once threatened you no longer achieves its intended effect, so the system adapts. Reassignment begins invisibly first, as a quiet withdrawal of familiar challenges, and then as the emergence of unfamiliar resistance. Many misinterpret this phase, assuming they have failed or attracted opposition unnecessarily. In reality, the operating field has shifted. Old defenses are replaced not because they were wrong, but because they are insufficient for the current level of engagement. Defenses are context-specific. Armor designed for one terrain becomes a liability in another. When your internal structure stabilizes, reflexive defenses, such as hypervigilance, people-pleasing, emotional numbing, or over-explaining, lose utility. They once protected you when exposure meant danger. Now, they restrict you because they consume energy needed for precision. The system removes them intentionally. This removal can feel like vulnerability at first, but it is actually a transition from defensive survival to strategic presence. You are no longer meant to deflect every threat. You are meant to withstand complexity without fragmentation. Warfare sophistication always reflects value. No one escalates resources against what holds no consequence. Increased complexity of challenge is not evidence of fragility, but of relevance. Simple threats are deployed against simple targets. When pressure becomes nuanced, psychological, relational, or internal, rather than overt, it indicates a different tier of engagement. The resistance adapts because brute force no longer works. This is why challenges begin to target timing, patience, identity, and resolve rather than safety. The aim shifts from stopping you outright to exhausting you gradually. Understanding this removes confusion. You are not under attack because you are weak. You are being tested because you are effective. Increased pressure correlates directly with increased access. Access here does not mean privilege or reward. it means proximity to influence. As access increases, so does responsibility. Systems apply pressure to verify stability before granting reach. This is universal across domains: engineering, leadership, physiology, and strategy. Bridges are load-tested before use. Structures are stressed before occupancy. In the same way, internal frameworks are tested before expansion. Pressure reveals fractures early, so they do not cause collapse later. What feels like opposition is often inspection. What feels like delay is often calibration. Removing fear requires reframing threat as confirmation rather than danger. Threat only exists when something valuable is at risk. If nothing mattered, nothing would push back. Fear arises when the mind interprets pressure as punishment or warning instead of validation. When you understand that pressure is evidence of positioning, fear loses leverage. The question shifts from "what did I do wrong?" to "what capacity is being verified?" This reframing restores agency. You stop bracing and start observing. You respond instead of react. Old defenses were reactive. They anticipated harm and minimized exposure. New positioning requires responsiveness. It demands clarity, not contraction. This is why emotional regulation becomes critical. Not suppression, but regulation. You are not meant to be unfeeling. You are meant to remain coherent under strain. That coherence is the qualification. Spiritual reassignment is less about new abilities and more about refined thresholds. You tolerate less distortion. You engage fewer battles. You conserve energy for what matters. Warfare sophistication reflects value because value determines strategy. What is trivial is ignored or overwhelmed quickly. What is consequential is approached carefully. Subtle pressure replaces overt force. Distraction replaces obstruction. Delay replaces denial. These are signs of escalation, not demotion. When access increases, visibility increases, even if no one is watching consciously. Systems respond to influence potential before it manifests publicly. This is why pressure can feel anticipatory. It arrives before outcomes. It is future-oriented. It tests whether you can hold what you have not yet been given. Fear dissolves when you see that nothing is trying to destroy you. Something is trying to assess you. Assessment feels invasive if you think you are being judged. It feels neutral if you recognize it as measurement. Measurement does not imply failure. It implies readiness. Reassignment also explains why familiar coping mechanisms fail. They were optimized for containment, not expansion. Containment keeps you safe. Expansion requires openness. The nervous system resists this initially because it associates openness with risk. But the environment has changed. What once endangered you no longer holds the same power. The system updates slowly, releasing old defenses as it confirms safety through repeated exposure. This is why the process feels uneven. Some days you feel steady. Some days old fears resurface. This is not regression. It is decommissioning. Each fear surfaces to be verified as obsolete. Once verified, it loses authority. Pressure accelerates this process. It brings hidden dependencies into awareness. It forces choice. Choice solidifies position. Over time, you notice that threats lose emotional charge even if circumstances remain challenging. This is the signal that reassignment is stabilizing. You are no longer reacting from preservation, but operating from placement. Placement is quiet. It does not seek validation. It does not argue. It holds. When fear is reframed as confirmation, courage becomes unnecessary. You are not pushing yourself to be brave. You are simply aligned. Alignment neutralizes fear because there is nothing to negotiate. You stop asking whether you can handle what is coming and start recognizing that what is coming requires exactly who you have become. This is the essence of reassignment. You are not being moved randomly. You are being positioned deliberately. The pressure is not a warning to retreat. It is evidence that retreat is no longer an option, because the role has already changed. Lions and bears never appear on a stage. They do not announce themselves. They do not come with witnesses, applause, or recognition. They arrive in obscurity, in spaces where no one is watching closely enough to validate what you survive. That is why they qualify. Unseen battles are not lesser trials. They are the only ones capable of proving substance without performance. When David spoke of the lion and the bear, he was not reminiscing about danger for dramatic effect. He was naming credentials no one else could verify. No one awarded him a title for surviving them. No one promoted him afterward. No one even knew. And that is precisely why those encounters mattered. They tested obedience without audience courage, without reward and responsibility, without recognition. Anyone can rise when watched. Very few remain aligned when invisible. Lions and bears represent pressures that threaten what has been entrusted to you, not what belongs to you. David was protecting sheep that were not his legacy, not his dream, not his future throne. He was guarding something assigned, not something glamorous. That distinction matters. Many people obey only when the task advances their identity. Qualification requires obedience when the task only proves character. These battles happen before language forms around purpose, before vision becomes articulated, before destiny is named. They are pre-verbal trials. You do not yet know why you are there. You only know that something under your care is threatened, and you must respond. There is no prophecy attached, no promise spoken, only responsibility. This is how real preparation begins. Goliath was never David's first test. He was simply the first visible one. Visibility creates the illusion of origin. Observers assume the public battle is the beginning because it is the first moment they can see. But visibility is always late. It arrives after capacity has already been built. Public breakthrough is not where strength is forged. It is where strength is revealed. By the time David faced Goliath, the outcome was already decided internally. Not because he was confident, but because his nervous system had already learned how to stand under threat. He had faced violence without panic. He had moved toward danger without permission. He had acted decisively without instruction. Those responses were trained in isolation. You cannot improvise that under observation. You either have it or you don't. Preparation without witnesses strips motivation down to its core. When no one is watching, obedience has no external reinforcement. There is no praise to sustain effort, no social pressure to maintain integrity, no reputation to protect. The only thing operating is alignment. That is why isolation is not abandonment. It is filtration. It removes performative obedience and leaves only what is real. What you do in those moments is not influenced by how it will be perceived, because it will not be perceived at all. That is why heaven treats them as qualifying ground. Obedience learned in isolation becomes instinct, not decision. You stop negotiating with fear. You stop asking whether you should act. You simply do. This is what made David dangerous to Goliath. Not size, not skill, not confidence, but unhesitating alignment. Goliath expected negotiation, intimidation, delay. He had been winning by presence alone. David did not engage that framework. He did not posture. He did not measure himself. He did not seek consensus. He responded as he always had. The lion and the bear taught him that threat does not get to set terms. Responsibility does. Those unseen battles also teach proportion. When you have faced real danger alone, spectacle loses its power. Noise does not confuse you. Scale does not intimidate you. Goliath looked large to men who had only faced crowds. He looked familiar to someone who had faced predators. Preparation without witnesses also corrects motive. You learn whether you obey because you believe in the assignment or because you enjoy being seen fulfilling it. Only the first survives obscurity. Many people crave visibility because they skipped isolation. They want the affirmation that should have been settled privately. But when preparation happens properly, visibility feels secondary. It does not define you. It only positions you. This is why public breakthrough feels inevitable in hindsight. It is not because circumstances aligned magically, but because internal readiness eventually intersects with external demand. When that intersection happens, it looks sudden to observers. They call it favor luck or destiny. They do not see the years of quiet calibration. They do not see the muscle memory formed in fear. They do not see the restraint learned in boredom. They only see the result. And results always look dramatic when the process was hidden. Inevitability does not mean ease. It means alignment has removed alternative outcomes. Once obedience has been trained deeply enough, deviation becomes unlikely. David could not have responded differently to Goliath even if he wanted to. His body already knew what to do. That is what preparation produces. Not choice, but default. The public moment reveals what isolation built. It does not create it. This is why you cannot rush visibility without risking collapse. Without lions and bears, Goliath would have crushed him, not because David lacked potential, but because potential untested is unstable. Unseen qualification battles stabilize potential. They integrate belief with action. They remove fantasy. They teach consequence. And when the visible moment arrives, it does not feel like promotion. It feels like continuation. That is the mark of true preparation. Public breakthrough is not a departure from who you were becoming. It is simply the first time others notice who you already are.